Okay, good. What else? Anybody? I know I kind of hit you this morning. That's kind of a deep thought, isn't it? I mean, unless you've thought about that. You think it might be good to talk about Jesus in some way? Might that be maybe a good place to at least think about, right? Well, there are a lot of things I think we can talk about. And in the course of my life, when I've met people that say, well, would you study with me? And of course, as preachers or as Christians, we love it when somebody says, would you study with me? Because we don't get that an awful lot. But when I talk to people about the gospel, I start with a lesson that I want to talk with you about this morning. And I want you to give it some thought as to, is this something that might be beneficial for you to discuss with somebody? And I'm sure I'm not going to talk to you about anything you don't know or anything profound by any means, but it's something that I think is important as we think about talking to other people about the gospel. I want you to be turning to Genesis, the first chapter. We're going to begin, at least I want to begin with where I think we ought to begin, and that's really in the beginning. We're not going to look at that initially, but I want you to think about something as we begin to move in this direction. If I want you to think about this hypothetical situation. If you found yourself on an island somewhere by yourself and you knew absolutely nothing, the only thing you could do would be reason and think for yourself, but you knew absolutely nothing. Tell me one question you might ask yourself. What's one question you would ask yourself? What? How do I get off that? That'd be a good question to ask. That might even be the first question to ask. But fundamentally, you don't know anything. You don't even know you're on the island. You don't even know what the island is. Now we're getting somewhere, okay? Well, but you can think, but you know absolutely nothing. What's a question you'd ask yourself? Why am I here? That's a great question. Why am I here? Okay? Why am I here? What's another question? What am I supposed to do? All right. What's my purpose? That had something to do with why am I here? What's something else? Where am I going? Okay. There's even two more fundamental issues than the ones we've discussed, I think. Who am I? You don't even know who you are. Okay. I think that's huge. I got to know who I am. Okay. What's something else? Yeah. Where did I come from? How did I get here? Okay. I got to know who am I? And either who or how or by what means did I arrive here, okay? So let's just basically say there are three fundamental questions. Who am I? Who put me here? Or how did I get here? And why am I here? Now I want to suggest something to you. Everybody asks those same questions. You may be sitting here this morning, you say, I know the answers to those questions. I know you do. Might I tell you something? Most people don't. Most people don't. They have no idea what the answers to those questions are. Now, they're looking for the answers to those questions, and they're listening to people who think they know the answers to those questions, but in my judgment, most people in our world don't have any idea what the answers to those questions are. They're looking for those answers, but they don't know what they are, and because they don't, they basically are living their lives moving in directions that they have no idea where they're going. And that really is the issue, isn't it, with most people? There's no purpose because they don't understand their origin, they don't understand their identity, and so they're just simply living their life for themselves, and they're trying to fulfill in some way or another what it is that they want. And may I say this to you, how meaningless life is if all you're about is trying to fulfill what you want, because that's something that you're never going to satisfy. And that's the problem with most people. That's why this peace that passes understanding, that's why most people don't have that kind of peace. They're continually in pursuit of something that basically they're never going to find because they don't even know what they're looking for. So when I talk to people, I want to help them understand initially, listen, fundamentally, you've got to know who you are. And most people have no idea. Now, when I came in this morning, and I didn't know most of you, so when I would walk up to you, I'd put out my hand, or you'd put out your hand, and we'd shake hands. And what would you, when I told you my name, what would you usually say to me? I met Sonny in the parking lot. He just about ran over me out here. No, not really. But I've known Sonny. Okay, so but I didn't recognize him, so I put up my hand. He said, I'm Sonny Sharp. I said, I'm Kenny Moorer. Good to meet you. Good to see you again. And I realized who he was when he introduced himself. But is that really who he is? You're going, well, yeah, that's who he is. We know him. He's been here for a long time. Well, fundamentally, that's not who he is. That's his name. But he could change his name to Kenny, which would be a better name than Sonny, right? He could change his name. But that wouldn't, in essence, change who he is. See, our problem is we talk about names, and names are distinctive. Johnny, I know the difference. If somebody says Johnny to me here, I know we're talking about Johnny, okay? But he could change his name, but that's not fundamentally, that doesn't change who he is. And the problem is that most people, when they identify themselves, well, who are you? They tell you their name. And I get that. I understand it. But that's not fundamentally who we are. And I want to talk to you for a minute about who you really are. And I hope that not only, it's not that you don't understand these things, but I hope that maybe what I want you to see is when we talk about these things to people, it helps them get a foundation or a basis by which then they can move in all these directions that they need to move in to understand who they really are. All right, let's look in Genesis, the first chapter. The Bible now identifies, we've identified these questions. Who am I? Who put me here and why am I here? And the Bible identifies the answers to all those questions, correct? To the question of who put me here, what does the Bible say? Yeah, in the beginning, God. God put me here. And may I say this to you, if somebody doesn't fundamentally get that, their movement in their life as to answering other questions is going to be skewed. If you don't start with the truth, and the truth is that God created us, if you don't start with that, and if you start somewhere else, you're never going to get to the right point. You're never going to get there. So you start with God. God created me. All right? For what purpose? Why did God create me? Okay, that's one objective. Well, what's the primary purpose of God creating me? Serve God, do His commandments, and to glorify Him. We're to bring honor and glory to Him. We are His creatures. That's what Genesis 1 is basically going to tell us. We're His creatures, and other passages we're going to look at tell us that. But because we're His creatures, our aim and our purpose is to glorify Him. And anything that's apart from that in your life, that's not seeking to glorify Him, is moving away from Him. But, you know, God is a sovereign God. We're going to look at that some over the course of the week when we talk about what God is and who He is and why He can do what He does. But He is a sovereign God. And His purpose for creating us is so that we would glorify Him, so that we would bring honor and glory to His name. And so that's fundamentally, again, what we must do. And that brings us the greatest peace and the greatest joy because we are honoring Him that way. Now, look at Genesis 1. I know you're there. I've asked you to turn there 3 times. Look at Genesis 1. Somebody read Genesis 1, 26 and 27 for me, please. Who's got that? Anybody? Read it. Thank you. All right. I want to ask you a question. Now I want to ask you this question. Who am I? I am a person who is what? Created how? In God's image. Now may I just ask you this question? How many people understand that? You ask people, who are you? That's about the last thing they're going to say, isn't it? They're not even going to think about that. Most of us wouldn't even say that. But most of us know that, okay? We know that. And what I want you to look at is fundamentally, what does that mean? If we understand what that means, then it helps us with establishing ourselves and moving in the right direction. What is an image? What's an image? Oh, that's a good point, Terrence. It's a representation. Anyway, some of you know my father. Okay, I'm hoping my mom and dad will be here tomorrow night. But if you've never seen my Father, what kind of man, what size man do you think He is? Thank you, Nancy. He's tall. Don't say wide, just say tall. You think my Father's handsome? Don't answer that, Johnny. Thank you. Sure, yeah, He's handsome. I think He's a very handsome man, and I'm a chip off the old block, I think. He's tall. He's a bit overweight. Don't tell him I talked about him tomorrow night if he's here. Please don't say that. But yeah, but when you see him, you're going, yeah, I see that. And some of you probably, you may not say it to me or him, but you might say, well, I see a resemblance. Okay, I see a resemblance. Am I my dad? No. Am I like my dad? Yes. I'm like him, but I'm not him. I'm like God, but I'm not God. I don't ever forget that, okay? I'm not trying to tell you that there are times when I think I am, but there is a real sense in which we are all like God. And if that's the case, we better be sure to understand in what capacity that is. Because if we're like Him, we've got to know what that means to us. And we are made in His image. We're made, the passage tells us, after our likeness. And while those words are not exactly synonymous, they're pretty close to meaning the same thing. In His image and after His likeness. Or after, the passage would say, after our likeness, the plural term for God. Okay, referring to that. So what I want us to think about this morning is, how are we like God? Tell me some ways that we're like God. We have a spirit. John 4. God is a spirit. And those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth, is what He told the woman in Samaria. So we have a spirit. That's what's one aspect. What's another aspect? Yeah. Okay, we know good from evil. Good. He knows that. We know that. What else? How are we like God? Yeah, we love. There are certain things, certain characteristics of God that we have, okay, that other parts of creation don't have, right? Turn over to Psalm 8. I want us to look at Psalm 8. We're going to, and again, I want you to see that again, to me, these are fundamental things that help us understand exactly who we are and where we have to move toward, what we have to move toward. Look at Psalm, the 8th chapter. Who wrote this psalm? Thank you, David. Yeah. You know, listen, if you're ever playing any kind of trivia game and somebody asks you who wrote a particular psalm, let me just go ahead and tell you, just go ahead and guess David. You're probably going to get it right most of the time, so go ahead and guess him. This is a psalm, and I want to read part of this. I want you to follow along as we read. And here's what I want you to be thinking about. This is a psalm in which David begins to think about. Matter of fact, the Hebrew idiom that he uses twice here, he talks about, what is man that thou art mindful of him? And the Son of Man that the Old King James says, that thou visitest him. I think that's the way it says. That's hard for me to even say. But the idea is why did you make man? And I want you to think about what David said. So follow, if you will, as we read Psalm, the 8th chapter. Let's begin in verse, let's just read it all. He says, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Now, may I just stop and say, that's a pretty profound statement. Okay, there's a lot in there that doesn't have specifically to do what we're talking about, but there's a lot in there. Okay, look at verse 2. Out of the mouth of babes, nursing infants, you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. And then he says in verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beast of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. I want to suggest that David is trying to, I don't think he's trying to figure it out. I think he understands it, but I think he is stating really who man is. And he's going back and reestablishing the fact that man is contrasted to other parts of creation. And I think that's what he's talking about. He says in verse 2, when I consider. What does it mean to consider something? Contemplate. That's a great word. Who said that? Way to go. If I had a gold star, I'd give it to you. It's contemplate. What somebody said something over here. Think about. Okay. Contemplate, think about. It's giving deliberate thought to. You consider things that are important to you. If I'm going to lunch and I'm going to eat fast food, as we typically call it, I don't have to consider much of what I'm going to order. You tell me I'm going to Wendy's, I know exactly what I'm going to order. If I'm going to McDonald's, I know what I'm going to order. And it's always going to be upsized. Just know that ahead of time, okay? But I know what I'm going to get because I've already thought about that. That's not the kind of consideration we're talking about here. This kind of consideration are things that are important to us. Things that are very important to us. When Beth and I began to date, we were friends really before we began to date. That doesn't mean after we started dating and married we weren't friends, but that's kind of the way our relationship started. And the first 2 or 3 times we went out, I enjoyed it, and apparently she enjoyed it. And what we decided is that we would continue to date. We would continue to pursue each other. And so we did that. And so eventually, as time went on, we began, I think the right way to do it is to consider each other. There were times when I'd drop her off at her apartment and I'd leave her and I'd be thinking to myself, this may be something that I need to pursue a little bit more strongly. And what I was doing, I was thinking about that. I was considering that. Okay? And that's what we do when we consider certain things. Things that are important to us, we give that kind of time to. And David was doing that. He said, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, that's the idea of creation, creating something with your fingers. So David says, when I think about that, there are some things that become very, very important to me. And I want you to think about what David was thinking about. God had given him this ability to think and to reason. And he's contrasting that right here, I think, in Psalm the 8th chapter. He's going to talk about 4 things that I think are critically important for us to understand that we are compared to. First of all, he talks about the moon and the stars. Okay? Somebody tell me what a star can do. What can a star do? Basically. Star either. All right, it reflects, okay, or the unscientific guy that I am, it shines, okay, either shine burns, or let's simply, it either burns or it burns up. It's either shining, or it's probably falling or dying somewhere, okay? So those are fundamentally the 2 things that a star can do. And who determined what a star can do? God did. God made it. That's part of what they said. When I consider the moon and the stars, when I consider the works of your fingers, okay, I see what you've done. And while he doesn't say this specifically, I think what he's saying is, stars just shine and stars die. Now, does any of the credit or the discredit go to the star when that happens? No. Oh, the stars just do what the moon shines because God, by the laws of nature, created it. He designed it. He put it up there, and that's what it does. And neither the credit nor the discredit ever goes to the moon, ever goes to a star. Nobody goes to the moon saying, you're doing a great job, keep up the good work. Nobody does that. Because God created it, and that's what it does. So that's one aspect of creation that we really need to compare ourselves to. We're both created. The moon's created and we're created, but that's not who we are. Let's take a flower. Flower's alluded to here. It's not mentioned specifically, but let's take that as part of creation. What can a flower do? Bloom. And if it's not in the process of blooming, what's it in the process of doing? Dying. Okay? It is seeds planted, and the flower comes up, it's continuing to grow, and at some point it's beginning, it may bloom and it may look pretty for a while, and then it begins to die. Does any of the credit or the discredit ever go to the flower? Can the flower do anything to make it bloom or make it die? No. Flowers do what flowers do. But none of the credit or the discredit ever goes to the flower, right? But that's part of creation. A flower is part of God's created earth. Now let's notice something else. Now, let's take an animal, for instance. Animals are talked about here. He talks about how he's given animals that we can have dominion over them. Let's take a dog. Most people, I shouldn't say everybody, most people like dogs. We have a dog. We've had him for about 15 years. He's blind and he's deaf. But other than that, he leads a pretty good life. He kind of works his way around the house and kind of runs into things and adjusts and goes, but he's a pretty good guy. But there's certain things that our dog does, that your dog does, that stars and flowers can't do. What's something that a dog can do? Respond. Okay? What's something else? He's what? He guards. Okay. He can guard. What can he do with his mouth that I can do with my mouth? There's a lot of answers to that. Breathe, eat, bark. I bark. I'm barking now, right? And my dog barks. There are certain things that dogs can do. There are a lot of things that dogs can do like human beings can do. It may not be in the same way, but in essence they do the same things. Dogs can reproduce, just like human beings can reproduce. Dogs have puppies. Human beings have babies. Because God in His mind said, I want even the animal kingdom to reproduce. And so they can do that. Let me ask you a question. And I don't mean this in any kind of irreverent kind of way at all, but you know, when animals reproduce, I think it's safe for us to say they do that instinctively. You know, it never enters a dog's mind as he or she's growing older. You know, I don't think it ever enters their mind. They look across the street and the boy dog sees a girl dog and he goes, you know what? I feel a little differently toward her than I used to. Or she looks at that boy dog and she goes, you know, I feel a little differently toward him than I used to. I used to not have any feelings for that. Matter of fact, I used to hate that dog across the street. Now I don't hate that dog anymore. I want to go be with that dog now. And when the dogs have those kind of urges, I want to ask the question, but I'll just tell you, what do dogs do? Dogs do what dogs do, right? Why do they do that? They do that instinctively, right? They do that because that's what dogs do. You know what happens to males and females when they do what males and females do when they act instinctively? You know what God calls that? If they're not married, what does He call that? Sin. He calls that sin. What's the difference in male and female dogs engaging in that act and male and female human beings engaging in that act? That's exactly right. That's well said too. Men have souls. They have spirits like God, and they've been instructed. We've been instructed for what reason? Because we can understand instructions, right? And because we're moral beings. Can a dog do that? If you have a girl dog and she comes home one day, she's been out in the yard and she comes in and you're going, man, I got to quit feeding you so much. You're gaining weight. So for the next month, you don't give her as much food, and you don't give her as much food, and a month later, she's bigger than she was a month prior. And you're going, man, I really need to cut back. So you cut back on her, and another month goes by, and you're going, man, something's going on here. And finally you realize, you know what? She's going to have puppies. You don't sit her down and have a conversation with her. You don't go, what's the problem? We didn't have this discussion. You're going to have puppies, but we didn't talk about it. You don't do that. And then please, I'm not trying to be, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to talk about this to make you uncomfortable. But here's the point that I want to bring to your mind. The issue here is, She can't reason. She just went out and she acted instinctively. She went out and did what dogs do. A lot of times when I'm talking to young people, I make this point because here's the point I want to make to them. You can do what dogs do. But if you haven't thought about it and determined, here's why I'm doing that, and I have a right, I have a lawful right to do what it is that I'm going to do. If you don't do that, you sin because God's given you the ability to think. God's given you the ability to make that kind of choice. Dogs act instinctively. And if you act simply like a dog, you can do that, but you're not living the way God wants you to live. And you're not using this ability to think and to reason like God wants you to think. Now, when I talk to people, I talk to them about them the very first thing because I want them to understand you have a responsibility to God to reason and to think about what it is that you're doing. And the reason that you have that responsibility is because that's the way God's made you. He didn't make you like everybody else. You may want to act like everything else, and in most cases like everybody else. And what happens, folks, when people do that, they simply are going out and they're fulfilling what it is that they want to do. And isn't that the way most people live? We're going to talk about it probably tomorrow night in the lesson about the sensual and how people fulfill that. But may I just say this to all of us? Why do people fulfill themselves sensually? It's just what they want to do. It's what they like to do. Why do you listen to the things you listen to? Because you like it. Why do you eat what you eat? Because you like it. You don't eat what you don't like, do you? Why do you touch what you like? Why do you do things that make you feel good? Because it's what you like. It's what you want to do. And if that's the only thing that dictates what you do, you're in big trouble. You're in big trouble. And the problem with most people in our world, that's exactly what they do. They're doing what they want to do. Now what we have to do, because we have the ability to reason and think, we have to get that under control. God says, listen, I've given you the ability to enjoy yourself. I've given you your senses so that you can fulfill your desires just like everybody else. But you're not like a dog. And you're not like a flower. And you're not like the stars. You're a different part of creation. And you're a part of creation that needs to fulfill the things that God has intended for you to fulfill. And may I say, when a person doesn't understand that, fundamentally, folks, their life's not going to be what it ought to be. Now, let's look at let's go to Genesis 3. We've been in Genesis 1. And again, this is a story that obviously you're familiar with. But I just want you to think about this. If I'm talking to somebody that may not be very religious, or maybe they are, and I mention Adam and Eve, they know who Adam and Eve is, right? They know who Adam and Eve is. They know the story of Adam and Eve. But fundamentally, I want to talk to them because this is the point of the story, okay? You know the story well, beginning in chapter 3 in verse 1. Let's just read it. I know we know it, but let's read it. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Now, imagine, just stop right here. You already see the difference, right? Can you imagine God saying this to a star? Or to a flower? Or to a dog? God's not going to do that. He's already planning in their minds, you're going to have a choice to make. So in verse 4, then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Here's the case study, you see. God had said in Genesis 1, I created Adam and Eve. I'm going to put them in the garden, And I'm going to tell them, because you're human beings, you're not like the other parts of creation. You have the ability to think and you have the ability to reason. And here's what I'm going to tell you. And that's what he told them. He put them in there and he said, don't do this. As a matter of fact, when the serpent tempted them, they told him, this is what God told us to do and this is what he told us not to do. He said, one thing you don't do, don't eat of this tree. And obviously we know the story. Verse 7, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. So, I want to get to verse 9 in just a moment. So basically what we have in the very beginning, and again, fundamental, you see. This is the story of the Bible, isn't it? God and man together, God and man separated. Why? Because of sin. It's the story of the Bible. And again, if I'm making this initial lesson with somebody, I want them to understand this is fundamentally what the Bible is all about. Okay? There's us together, there's sin, there's separation, and then it's us together again. That's what the story of the Bible is about. And I want you to look at verse 9. If I ask you, what's the turning point of the Bible? What would you say? What's the turning point of the Bible? When does, or maybe another way to say that is, what's the most important point of the Bible? Maybe let's ask it that way. What would you say? What might you say? There's no right or wrong answer to this. So, resurrection. That's pretty critical. Matter of fact, that's what Paul would say. He would talk about the death of Christ and the burial and his resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, that's pretty essential. What else? Would we say his crucifixion is essential? Yeah. I mean, he died. That's pretty critical. Not any more critical than resurrection. Maybe after the fact, it's not as critical as the resurrection. I want you to look at verse 9. In my judgment, this is the crux. This is the most critical point of the entire Bible. And I want to share something with you about why I think that is. Have you ever played, when you were a kid, you ever play hide and seek? Remember that game? What's the point of that game? If I hide, what am I hoping to do? To be found. I can remember playing it with my sisters when I was a boy, and I would say, okay, both my sisters are younger. I'd say, Nita, you and Tam go hide, and I'll come find you. And they'd go hide, I'd go and eat lunch. And I'd be in the house and I'd hear somebody say, Kenny, Kenny. And I wouldn't answer. Kenny. I wouldn't go get them. I wouldn't answer. And in a few minutes, they'd both come in the house looking for me. What are you doing? I'm eating lunch. Of course, I was playing with them. But they'd be upset because I didn't go look for them. The whole point of hide and seek is come look for me. That's what this story is about. When man sinned, what did he do? He went and hid himself. Why did he hide himself? He was, what did you say, Jake? Afraid? He was ashamed because of what he had done, right? Look at what verse 9 says. I think this is real important. Now remember where there. Verse 9 says, then the Lord God called to Adam and said to him, what? Now I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think that God didn't know where he was? You think God's GPS was out that day? Couldn't locate him? Didn't know where he was? So he called. He said, where are you, Adam? Why did God call out, where are you, Adam? To get his attention. That's exactly right. This wasn't about God not knowing where. It wasn't like I can't find him. This issue was, do you know what you've done? Where are you? And this is why this is the turning point to me. I want you to think very carefully about this. Did God have to say that? What if man would have sinned? At that time we'd stop in 5 minutes. What if man had sinned and hid himself and God had never come looking for him. You ever thought about that? Think about how desperate we would be if when we sinned, God never came looking for us. You ever thought about that? And yet, in this passage, God begins this journey of bringing man back to God because of His love for us. We're going to talk about that some tonight in our lesson. But fundamentally, this is in the first lesson when I talk to people, this is fundamentally what I cover, because I want them to see that you have an obligation. Because you're made in the image of God, you have an obligation to use what He's given you that He hasn't given any other part of creation. You have the ability and the obligation to use your mind to answer to God for what He's done for you. God is sovereign. And because of that, He can do with it what He chooses to do with us, and He's asked us to honor Him by obeying Him. Now, fundamentally, I just want to ask you this question. If everybody in the world understood I'm made in God's image and I'm going to ultimately answer before God, let me ask you this. Would that change? Would that change what people do? Should it change what people do? Yeah, it ought to change what people do. But if they don't understand who they are fundamentally, then they're going to go ahead and live their lives simply the way they want to live. And folks, that's what's wrong with the world. Most people in our world are living the way they want to live. Isn't that what the Lord's invitation is? What are we doing when we ask people, we want you to give yourself to the Lord. We want you to honor God by coming and obeying what He wants you. What are we saying to people? We're saying, you got to stop thinking about yourself, and you have to start submitting to Him, and you have to start honoring Him. And then that goes back to this peace that we talked about that was mentioned in the very beginning. That's what people have to have. And that's the problem. When you're not pursuing that, you're not at peace with yourself, because you have forgotten fundamentally who you are. Now, if you get it, if you get the fact that, all right, God's given me the ability to reason, and this is His mind revealed, and because I'm a human being, He's given me the ability to understand this, so I've got to pursue this. You see how all this works together? But it all works together because God's given us the ability to understand it. And when we're seeking Him, I believe He'll honor us by showing us what it is that He wants us to know in His Word. I think that's what this is about. So that's my lesson this morning. That's what I try to help people understand fundamentally. Now, we're eventually going to get to Jesus and what He's done. We're going to get to all that, but we got to understand, first of all, you're going to be held responsible, and God's given you the ability to understand what it is that He wants you to know. And if we can teach people that, folks, I think we can begin to help them understand what it is that God wants them to do. Well, I appreciate your kind attention. Thank you very kindly.